by this point, it is hopefully clear that there are notable gender differences in the criminal justice process, right, in the way it is experienced. So here we're going to dig in a little further into some of the ways that plays out, in particular during the pretrial phase and then a bit into the sentencing phase as well. So the last video, we talked about chivalry, the chivalry hypothesis and the evil woman hypothesis, right? This notion that women tend to be punished more harshly or less harshly in a given circumstance, right? It doesn't tend to fall in the middle, right? So it's important to note that the way that these forces can affect a woman's experience in the criminal justice system can begin even prior to arrest, right? And we did touch on that, right? The fact that it can influence a police officer's decision whether or not to stop a person. So now we're going to discuss whether or not women are treated differently during the pretrial phase. So by pretrial, we're referring to they have been arrested, and charged, but not convicted. So, and their formal charges may not have been brought yet per se. So this could be in determining whether to make a plea bargain or whether to let them out on their own, release on their own recognizance, right? So at the pretrial stage, during this phase of the criminal justice process, the courts are concerned with identifying and understanding two primary factors. And the first is whether or not a person's going to commit crime if they're not held. So in other words, if they let them out, right, if they give them a bond or release them on their own recognizance, are they going to obey the law? And if not, then they're probably not likely to get released, okay? The other is whether or not they're actually going to show up to their court appearance, okay? If they think that they're going to skip out, then they don't, they're not going to let them go. So how they determine these, and much of what influences their determination on these issues is a person's criminal history. Okay, but it's worth noting that gender may certainly be involved as well. So there's typically three types of factors that are considered during this phase. So the first is the offense type. Okay, so whether or not it was a property crime or a violent crime or a drug crime. Okay, in the case that it's a property crime, the likelihood of whether or not they're going to be held, like pretrial detention, meaning they're going to be held in the criminal justice, whatever jail, right, waiting for trial. Okay, or whether they're going to release them. So pretrial, if they are a female that committed a property crime, they're less likely to face pretrial detention versus a woman that's charged with a crime against a person, so a violent crime or some sort of other interpersonal offense. Sorry. We also know though that if it's a drug offense, the chances of them being held go up. Okay, and this maybe because it suggests that they will not show up to court or that they will go out and commit crime again, right, in order to perpetuate their drug use. Okay, the next thing is criminal history, as I mentioned in the previous slide. So whether or not, if it's a first-time offender, you're much more likely to be released and not face pretrial detention. But that's more so the case for women. Now, but this is true for both men and women, to be sure. But it's a little bit more exaggerated among women or females, girls as well, I should say. Okay, so yeah, women who are charged with drug or property crimes are less likely to be detained than of any violent crime as well. Okay, and then the last piece is this ties to community, and you hear about this a lot. If you ever watch, any documentaries about any of the killers or any sort of offender, you'll hear them talk about their relationship to the community. Do they have friends and family nearby? Are they total loners? Do they have a job? Are they in school? Do they have something that's connecting them there? And the assumption is if a person has ties to a community, they're going to be less likely to flee, and it's going to be easier to find them should they not show up to court. Okay, now, as you might imagine, the type of offense and a person's criminal history and their ties to community look different based on gender. Okay, think about assumptions of motherhood, right? That greatly increases a woman's perceived ties to the community because they have a child. They're not going to flee with their child, and leave their child, or at least that's what they assume. Okay, right? And we know men are more likely to have a criminal history, and men are more likely to commit violent crime. So as a result, those taken together, gender explains a lot of the disparity in this pretrial, whether or not a person's held in pretrial detention. Okay. But yet we still see it throughout all the stages of the criminal justice system. Now, this is just a bit of a review of what we've already touched on. Okay, I'm kind of just going through them fast because you guys have these slides. This is essentially a review of the previous video. Okay, although we didn't quite talk about prosecution's decisions. So we do know that prosecutors are a bit more lenient on female offenders than male offenders. But that's not always the case, right? Think Evil Woman. Okay, and all right, but it's important to note that this is not just a one-size-fits-all, right? Certainly, the experiences amongst women vary. Okay, not all women face the same experience in the criminal justice system. So if we're comparing a racial minority female to a white woman, right, we see some notable differences here. So white women are more likely to engage in offending racial minorities are more likely to engage in offending. Now, remember how that is estimated. Okay, that is based on arrest records, which could certainly be skewed based on officer perceptions of the situation or officer prejudice. So white women might commit the most crime of everyone, but because they're assumed not to, they'll be overlooked. All right. We do know that women of color are punished more harshly than white women. To be sure, y'all, when we're talking about women of color, we mean any sort of racial minority. Okay, that's not language I typically like to use, but I'm gonna just go with it. Okay, it's an inclusive term to include Latinx, and Asian and Native American, Alaskan Natives, Pacific Islanders, whatever it might be. Okay, so this is just non-white. So we know non-white women are punished more harshly than white women for similar offenses, and that's important, y'all, because when you break it up by race, women of color's punishment starts to look more like men's. They are punished more similarly to men than they are to white women. Right, so they're also more likely to receive higher levels of bail and are less likely to be able to afford that bail to post it. So they get bail set pretty high; it's above what they can afford. So they're less likely to be able to post it. So they sit and wait in pretrial detention. Okay, and then they make it to court. Chances are, if they are struggling to afford bail, then they're struggling to afford an attorney. And whether or not that is the case, in general, we see that they are incarcerated at a higher rate than white women. So again, the importance of this slide is just that it is not a one-size-fits-all experience. Okay, there is variation within women. All right, so not surprisingly, although there are similar gender disparities throughout sentencing practices as well. Okay, and these are influenced by so many different factors. Okay, but in particular, there's two key pieces, right? So two types of factors, I should say. The first are legal factors, and those that are related to the law and things that are set up by legal precedent. And then there's extra legal factors, or those that are beyond the scope of the law. All right, so we're going to go into those in depth here. So first, legal factors these include things like the severity of the offense. Now this matters because the sentencing guidelines have been put in place such that a judge only has so much discretion. They may want to let a person walk free, but if that person committed an offense that is outlined on the sentencing guideline, the judge doesn't have a choice. They have to follow those guidelines. So what those guidelines are, if you can picture like a sheet that pretty much has a little chart on it that tells you, okay, if they check all these boxes, then this is their offense. If they have these ones, then this is their sentence. Okay, so it significantly reduces the discretion of a judge. Now, of note, these were put in place to try to reduce gender and racial disparities, actually. But what's happened now is that what we've seen is a massive growth in our prison population, or as you know it, mass incarceration. So another piece that comes into play with offense severity related to sentencing guidelines are mandatory minimum sentences. So if there's a large number of offenses, but a majority of which are related to drug use, that trigger what is known as a mandatory minimum, or that is a standard or a minimum amount of time that a person can be sentenced, and normally they're about 5 years. But there's variation there, so take that with a grain of salt. But in general, if a person is convicted of an offense with a mandatory minimum, and say that carries a mandatory minimum of 5 years, then that person's serving at least 5 years no matter what. Even if the judge looks at it and says, no, there was extenuating circumstances, this person doesn't, they're not a threat to society, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Okay. Another legal factor that comes into play in sentencing is a person's criminal history, as we've already touched on. And that influences how they are perceived. Okay. But to go with that, it's important to note that a lot of states still have what are known as 3 strikes laws. So if a person gets charged with their third offense, it'll trigger a mandatory life sentence. Sometimes a mandatory life sentence without the possibility of parole. Now, what's interesting about these 3 strikes laws is that the offense that triggers them doesn't have to be especially egregious. So there was one of the first cases that came in front of the Supreme Court about it. The man had done some work and been paid for working on an air conditioning unit, and his customer was unsatisfied with his work, and he wouldn't give the money back. And so he was charged with stealing that money, and that triggered a mandatory life sentence without the possibility of parole. So it wasn't like he had stolen, thousands of dollars. I think it was like $100 and some dollars, right? But that influences the sentencing decision, okay? And keep in mind, men are more likely to commit crime, so they're more likely to be repeat offenders. And as we've already touched on, offense type also influences how they're sentenced, okay? But there's also extra legal factors that matter, right? These are those factors outside of the legal system that are not the judge, the court, the officers, the jury, the policies in place, mandatory minimums, things beyond that are relevant, okay? So these include things like the type of attorney a person has, all right? If a person has a public defender, right, they're more likely to receive a harsher sentence, okay? A person that has a private attorney is more likely to be sentenced much less. Okay, so yeah, having a public defender doubles the likelihood of incarceration. So ties to community, which came up when we were discussing pretrial decisions, okay, those also matter for sentencing decisions. So here, what they're looking at is not if this person's going to run away before court comes, before their court date. Now we're looking at, do they have a support system that will help them and keep them, in line and away from crime? So do they have things that they can engage in the conventional part of society that aren't criminal, that are pro-social, okay, and that can help them reintegrate and be a contributing member of society? In particular, what they look at, or that I would say are the most significant, is motherhood, okay, and whether or not they have children or are pregnant, okay. If they have another parent, that may make it, or if they have a spouse who can take care of the kids, the judge may then feel less hesitant to sentence them more harshly. But when a judge is sitting there looking at a mother who has 3 kids and no significant other, many times those children influence the judge's decision. So yeah, again, it's not necessarily gender that matters, because they don't care that it's the woman, right? They're not thinking, oh, this poor mom. They're thinking, oh, well, these children, okay, these children need their mother. And so what's interesting is that if a woman doesn't have a family or is non-familied, so to speak, they don't get the same type of leniency, even if they have ties to the community. So in other words, being a mom is linked to being treated more leniently in sentencing. All right, at this point of the video, I hope you were paying good attention, because if you're still watching, you will know to do this. There is a question that you will be asked to answer in the next step of the module. However, instead of answering that question, you can tell me what your favorite movie is and why. And or you can share a picture of your pet. Whatever that might be, dog, cat, lizard, whatever. I just kind of want to have an idea of who's actually watching these videos and paying attention. So you may still choose to answer the question, but if you do, make sure you make a note that you heard this, okay? If you just tell me your favorite movie and why, and I won't take off if you don't tell me why, but I'm going to be curious, so you should tell me why. And then also, or show me a picture of your pet, you will receive the full points for the question, okay? All right, so the last thing that we're going to discuss here is the more formal explanation for this sentencing disparity. All right, so this is the theory of focal concerns. This was initially developed to explain issues or gender disparities, but now it's more used to look at race issues, okay, and like racial disparities in sentencing. So it's used to understand how judges exercise their discretion. Okay, so the basic premise, right, is that judges don't have a whole lot of time with the offender, right? They don't get to know the ins and outs of their case, of their circumstances, and they are still charged with making a decision that is best for them and for the community. So the argument goes that they make their sentence, or the focal concerns argues that judges make their sentencing based on 3 foci. All right, so the first is how blameworthy the offender is. So this reflects both the nature and the egregiousness of the offense, okay, as well as how involved they actually were and what their previous record is. Okay, so if the more serious the offense and the more culpable they're seen as, the more serious the punishment will be given. Okay, the second focus is this desire, responsibility, and interest in protecting the community. So they're weighing how much of a threat or a danger you are, or the defendant is, in making their decision. So they are trying to decide what is going to be best to protect the community. And then finally is this concern for practical constraints, which what we're talking about here are more of the everyday kind of issues and the more practical, right? So whether or not the offender can do time, right? Maybe they have extenuating, maybe they have terminal cancer and they have a week to live. Okay, so in that case, maybe if it's especially serious, maybe they'll sentence them to 100 years just to send a message, right? Like in Larry Nassar's case, he's not terminally ill, but he is, older, and he was sentenced to 175 years. There's no way he can serve that, but it was sending a message loud and clear, right? Or they can go the other way, right? Whereas if you're about to die and you're not particularly dangerous, we don't really need to protect you, you're not that much of a threat to the community, then okay, that practical constraint is influencing that sentencing decision. Okay, this allows the judge to consider organizational concerns and criminal justice level concerns, right? Such as the court's reputation, the caseload, the current population held in the local correctional facility, right? So if they're extremely overcrowded, then they might be more compelled to give you some form of community supervision, like probation, right? So taking all of these together, okay, I forgot individual concerns, okay, like it says here, like dependents, right? If they have a dependent on them, right? We know that, as previously mentioned, that motherhood influences decision, but that's maybe if you have a sick parent you're taking care of, okay, or if you have special needs, some whatever that might be, that will influence how they sentence you, okay? So, but what does this have to do with gender? Okay, well, as I said, right, judges don't have the time to really know the ins and outs of the case and really know the offender. So, I mean, based on seeing them in the courtroom for 15, 20 minutes, how are they supposed to be able to know all those things? So the argument is, from focal concerns, is that instead they rely on the stereotypes that are tied to certain characteristics, things that are easily observable, that they can make a much quicker decision about how to handle it. So if a female comes in for sentencing, they are not having time to evaluate their ties to the community or practical constraints or their blameworthiness. Instead, they're looking and they go, well, she's a female, so she's probably not that dangerous, so we don't really need to worry about sentencing her too seriously. And she probably has kids because she looks like she's, mid-30s. She probably has children she needs to care for. They don't know, right? This is all presumption, but nevertheless, they make their sentencing decisions accordingly. Okay, we see similar assumptions made on the basis of a defendant's race as well.